Before you sleep, I want to tell you something strange. Not about blood or murder. It's about the feeling that someone's watching you, someone you can't name, someone you've never met, but who somehow knows your exact train schedule. I don't tell stories to scare you. I tell them so we remember. Because once you remember, you can't forget. Right now, imagine this. It's 1983. The snow is falling thick across the Rostov region in the Soviet Union. You're on a late-night train, those creaky, dim-lit ones that feel like they belong in a novel, not reality. The windows fog over. The cabin smells faintly of boiled cabbage and rust. You're alone, except for a man sitting 2 rows ahead. He hasn't moved since you boarded. You swear he hasn't even blinked. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. It's here, between one village and the next, with nothing but pine trees and snow outside, that the first body was found. She was 9 years old. Her name was Yelena Zakotnova, and she never got off the train. They found her near a riverbank in Shakhty, her small hands frozen like they were still trying to reach someone. The Soviet police didn't take long to pin it on someone. Alexander Kravchenko, a known offender, was nearby. A convenient suspect. He said he was innocent. They executed him anyway. But the killings didn't stop. You'd think someone would have noticed. A man traveling constantly for work, always near train stations, always watching, always calm, and then vanished like snow melting off a roof. What no one knew then was that a predator had learned 2 valuable lessons from Yelena's murder: how to hide a body and how to watch his own hands. Chikatilo, his name wasn't spoken publicly until years later, wasn't interested in speed. His pleasure was in routine, observation, waiting. He kept a log. He read detective novels. He even had a family. And yet, during his business trips, he was silently collecting souls. Here's something you might not know. Chikatilo once applied to be a teacher. In fact, he was one, briefly. But he was fired for inappropriate behavior towards students. Of course, no one filed a real report. This was the Soviet Union. Shame was more powerful than safety. Historians are still debating whether the culture of secrecy, of denying the very idea of serial murder, allowed Chikatilo to flourish, or whether it was something deeper, something older, something that had always existed in the silence of forests and rail cars and school corridors. He wasn't flashy. He didn't leave calling cards or paint cryptic messages. What he left was absence, gaps, questions, and fear. I didn't learn about him through textbooks. I learned about him the way most people did, by accident. One winter, I was studying abroad in Moscow. I bought a used book in a market. Tucked between the pages was a newspaper clipping. It said, "Butcher Rostova Poyman," the butcher of Rostov, caught. It didn't say how many. It didn't say how long. Just that he'd been caught. Years later, I found out it was 53 victims, maybe more. Boys, girls, women, even a few men. He didn't have a type. Or maybe his type was anyone who couldn't fight back. Back to the train. You're still on it, remember? You look up again. That man 2 rows ahead is gone. You never saw him leave. You never heard the door. Just fog on the glass. And now it's your stop. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. They said the first body was a mistake, a crime of passion, a one-off. But the second was different. The third, even more so. By the time they found the 5th, buried beneath a soft carpet of pine needles near Novoshakhtinsk, no one could deny it anymore. Something else was happening. Something worse. Still, the Soviet authorities didn't use the term serial killer. They didn't even whisper it behind closed doors. That term wasn't allowed. Serial killers were a Western illness, a Hollywood fantasy, not something that could exist within the great orderly machine of the USSR. But the bodies kept appearing. They were all found in roughly the same areas, around Rostov Oblast, Shakhty, Novocherkassk, Bataysk, cities stitched together by train lines, factory towns, coal-smudged buildings. and woods. Always the woods. Dense, tall, whispering. And the victims, mostly young, many of them vulnerable. Street kids, orphans, runaways, girls trying to get to school, boys scavenging for scrap, people who wouldn't be missed right away. One boy was found with 42 stab wounds. Another had his tongue cut out. One girl's torso was discovered first, her limbs scattered days later. Some had been sexually assaulted, some were missing organs. Others, only recognizable by the clothing their mothers later sobbed over. It was the pattern of brutality that caught the attention of one detective. Viktor Burakov. Not a superhero, not flashy, just stubborn and tired. He began keeping his own records, quietly. His superiors told him not to waste his time. His wife told him to stop bringing the smell of morgues home. But something wouldn't let him quit. Here's something strange. At the time, the USSR didn't have a centralized database for violent crimes. That meant different regions could investigate nearly identical murders without ever realizing they were connected. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when everyone has only 5 pieces and no one's allowed to admit they're part of the same picture. Historians still debate whether Soviet isolationism directly contributed to the length of Chikatilo's killing spree. But imagine this. A man murders someone in 1981, then again in 1982, then 1983, 1984. Each year, the same rituals, the same escapes, the same comfort in knowing no one is coming. Andrei Chikatilo didn't look like a monster. He was thin, balding, wore thick glasses, mumbled to himself. At work, he was quiet, efficient. At home, he was a father, a husband, not affectionate, but consistent, reliable, predictable. You wouldn't notice him in a crowd. And that's what made him dangerous. At night, he often took long walks. No destination, just movement. He memorized the train schedules. He knew which stops had no cameras, which stations had broken lights, which trails led into woods that never asked questions. I remember one woman's account, years later after the trial. She said she once saw a man talking to a young boy at a train platform. The boy looked nervous. The man looked ordinary. She didn't say anything. Why would she? She still has nightmares about that night. Here's a strange fact not many people know. In at least 3 confirmed murders, Chikatilo tried to bite through his victim's flesh, but couldn't. His dentures were too weak. He would gnaw, then give up. But he left the marks anyway, like trophies, like calling cards. By 1984, the victim count had passed 20, but the case was still unofficial. Rumors swirled, parents whispered. Teachers warned students not to talk to strangers, but no one dared explain why. And then, someone was arrested. Not Chikatilo, a different man, a different life. He fit the profile. Kind of creepy, kind of alone. He confessed under pressure. Was he guilty? No one's sure. But he spent years in prison while the real killer kept riding the rails. It's like this nightmare had rules. As long as no one asked the right question, the monster would stay hidden. Some believe the killer's power came from the silence that surrounded him. Not literal power, something darker. That every time an official silenced an investigator, every time a file was lost, the killer fed off it, as if the system itself was building him a fortress. He wasn't clever, not in the Hollywood sense. He didn't leave riddles, didn't make phone calls, didn't write poems to the press. What he left was absence, the kind that echoes. But remember the detective, Burakov? He wasn't giving up. He was still watching. Quietly building his puzzle, piece by piece, even when no one believed him, even when no one wanted to. They say the devil hides in the details, but that's not true. The devil doesn't hide at all. He stands in plain sight and just waits for you not to care. By late 1984, there were at least 30 murders tied together by the most fragile of threads, found near train stations, in woods, often involving mutilation. But officially, nothing was connected. The Soviet state refused to admit what it didn't want to see. Remember Viktor Burakov? The detective who started collecting puzzle pieces in secret? He was working with microscopic resources, old maps, body reports copied by hand, rumors from small towns. But the longer he looked, the more he realized something. The pattern was real. Terrifying, but real. One victim had stab wounds that mirrored another's. Same depth, same angle. Another had their eyes removed, like the little girl from Shakti in '78. A boy's tongue was cut out, just like a girl's 2 years before. These weren't crimes of impulse. They were practiced, rehearsed. Stranger still, many of the bodies were left partially covered, almost like a twisted form of respect. A coat over the chest, a scarf wrapped once around the neck, sometimes even shoes lined neatly by the side. Chikatilo wasn't just killing, he was staging. You know what's strange? He never took trophies. No jewelry, no clothing, nothing for a shrine. He didn't need them. The act itself was the souvenir. In psychology, this is called ritualistic behavior. Andrei Chikatilo didn't just need to kill, he needed to perform. Like an actor walking onto a stage made of moss and dirt. He had a script, he had lines. And if you were unlucky enough to share a train ride with him, you might have been his final scene. Here's a chilling fact. Several victims were found with pine needles pushed under their fingernails. Whether this was part of the ritual or a result of struggling before death is still debated. But imagine that detail. The precision, the patience. That's not madness. That's something else. By now, local rumors were rampant. Some said it was a group of men. Others blamed Satanists or foreign spies. One theory even accused escaped American soldiers from Vietnam. Anything but the obvious, a Soviet man moving freely within their perfect system. Historians are still debating whether the refusal to publicly acknowledge serial crime was driven by ideology or fear. Admitting a monster existed meant admitting weakness, and weakness in the Soviet Union was forbidden. You want to know how Chikatilo got around so easily? He had a work pass from the state-owned company he was employed by. It let him travel without suspicion, without tickets, without questions. He was invisible because the system made him so. Let me paint you a picture. There's a boy waiting for a train in Kamensk. He's got a plastic bag with 2 pieces of bread and a jar of pickles. He's trying to visit his cousin. A man in a threadbare gray coat sits down beside him, says nothing at first, then offers to help him find a quicker route. The boy follows. He's never seen again. The authorities tell the family he probably ran away, that he'll come back, but he doesn't. No one comes back. Burakov, working around the system, finally convinces his bosses to form a task force. It's unofficial at first. No funding, no credit, just 4 detectives and a handful of autopsy reports. They hang a giant map of Rostov on the wall, each red pin a victim. Soon, the board looks like it's bleeding. A breakthrough comes not through DNA, but blood type. Yes, this was still the era before modern forensics, but it was better than nothing. Most of the murders shared a suspect profile, blood type A, non-secretor. Chikatilo was eventually typed as AB, secretor, which made it impossible, or so they thought. Turns out that too was wrong. He'd been mistyped. Again. Like every thread in this case, everything that could have helped got tangled in bureaucracy and blind spots. You ever hear the joke, the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended? Yeah, this case was proof. By now, Chikatilo was escalating. His killings became more frequent, sometimes 2 within a week. He began slipping up, leaving more blood, more evidence. But still, no one caught him. There's one case that sticks with me. A young girl, maybe 14. Her body was found near a shallow stream, mud in her mouth, a wound so deep the coroner couldn't tell which weapon caused it. Wrapped around her wrist was a piece of twine, common rope. You could buy it anywhere. But Burakov noticed something. The way it was tied, looped twice, then knotted in a square pull, was identical to another case months earlier. That loop tied them together. 2 victims, 1 killer. This was the pattern he needed. It's 1985, and the killer has a schedule. Not chaos, not frenzy. Routine. A pattern that no one sees, except the man watching from the station bench with a lukewarm thermos of tea and the eyes of someone who's seen too many autopsy photos. Burakov knows now what most people won't admit. This isn't random. This killer isn't lost in madness. He's organized, meticulous, possibly even bored. Andrei Chikatilo, the man no one suspects, has turned public transportation into his personal hunting ground. He boards trains with a leather satchel. Inside, a rope, a knife, sometimes a hammer. He doesn't run through the woods in a mask. He waits calmly in line at the kiosk, buys sunflower seeds, nods politely at elderly women. Then, when the moment's right, he lures them off the platform and into the trees. Here's a strange fact. Many of Chikatilo's killings took place within walking distance of a bathroom, a bus stop, or a bench. He planned for exhaustion, for cleanup, for rest. He treated murder like work. Clock in, clock out. No mess. The task force starts charting train schedules. They match departure times to victim discoveries. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. They set up surveillance at known hotspots, agents dressed as workers, students, lovers waiting under flickering lamps. They even have dogs. But Chikatilo is careful. Too careful. Still, cracks are forming. He's slipping. One rainy afternoon, he approaches a 15-year-old girl at a station bench. He tells her she reminds him of his daughter. She walks with him. She doesn't come back. But this time, witnesses describe him. Balding, glasses, nervous blinking, carries himself like a teacher. The police pick up 5 suspects based on this description. None are him. One is beaten into confessing. He's innocent. But the confession fits the profile, so they add it to the file. Another false ending. Historians are still debating whether the obsession with closing cases, instead of solving them, created a kind of justice by numbers in the USSR, a place where paperwork mattered more than evidence. Meanwhile, Chikatilo is watching the news. He knows what the police know. He changes tactics. He starts attacking boys again. One victim is found deep in the woods, his body partially buried. His fingernails are gone, burned, as if someone tried to remove the last trace of a struggle. You know what's worse? They almost missed that body entirely. A dog found it. Chikatilo begins to escalate, not just in frequency, but in confidence. He returns to old sites, revisits crime scenes. In some cases, he even sits near the families of his victims at bus stops. Listening. I know that sounds like a movie villain, but this part, it's real. A mother of one victim swears she saw him 2 days after her son vanished, sitting on the same bench, watching the crowd. She looked him in the eye. He smiled, then stood up and walked away, and still no one connects the dots. Here's what's insane. Chikatilo had already been arrested once in 1984 for acting suspiciously near a crime scene. The police searched his belongings and found ropes, knives, and a jar of Vaseline. But they let him go. Why? Because his blood type didn't match the sample from a prior murder. Remember the mistyping? Yeah, that. Andrei Chikatilo, the man responsible for dozens of murders, was free to walk away because of one forensic error on a clipboard. That's the moment Burakov nearly quit. He'd spent months living in a morgue, sleeping 3 hours a night, chasing shadows and train timetables. And just like that, the killer had been in his grasp and slipped. I know you're probably thinking, how did no one notice? But think about it. The average Soviet worker had one goal: keep their head down, get through the day. Don't make waves. The idea of evil wasn't part of the system. You couldn't call something evil if it wasn't officially acknowledged to exist. And Chikatilo knew that. He exploited silence the way a magician exploits distraction. In the next 3 months, he kills 4 more people, including a boy only 9 years old. Burakov starts to unravel. He loses weight, stops going home. His team rotates shifts around the clock. They begin carrying sleeping bags. They start interviewing train passengers like they're missionaries, desperate to convert someone into a witness. But the truth is, witnesses don't help when the killer is ordinary. That's what makes it so much worse. If there's a sound you never want to hear again, it's the buzz of a fluorescent light in a Soviet interrogation room. No windows, just stale air, cheap cigarettes, and a chair that looks like it's seen more confessions than priests ever will. That's where a man named Alexander Kravchenko sat in 1980. And that's where he signed a confession to a murder he didn't commit. You remember Yelena Zakotnova, right? The first known victim, 9 years old, found near a river in Shakhty. It was Chikatilo, but no one knew that then. The police needed someone to blame. They found Kravchenko. He was an ex-con, convicted of rape years earlier. He was near the scene, drank too much, didn't have a solid alibi. In a system that demanded results, he was perfect. So they brought him in, questioned him for days. No lawyer, no phone calls, just pressure, just silence and pain. Eventually, he confessed. It didn't matter that he retracted it, or that the evidence was weak, or that his wife swore he was home. The courts needed closure, and they got it. Kravchenko was convicted, executed, and the case was officially closed. Andrei Chikatilo? He moved on, found new victims, refined his method. Here's something most people miss. The real killer actually testified at Kravchenko's trial. Chikatilo was brought in as a witness, just a man who'd seen something odd near the river. He sat in the courtroom, calm, polite. He watched an innocent man take the fall for his crime and said nothing. That should haunt you. It haunts me. Some historians believe Chikatilo needed Kravchenko to take the blame, that it gave him a sense of control, validation. Others say it simply emboldened him, that seeing the system protect him confirmed he was invincible. Whatever the reason, after that trial, the killings accelerated. He didn't need to be cautious anymore. By 1985, there were over 30 known victims. The task force had grown, still unofficial, still underfunded, but growing. They began working from a bunker beneath the Rostov militia headquarters. It was windowless, always cold, and lit by buzzing yellow bulbs. They nicknamed it the dungeon. Burakov was there, always there. He barely spoke to his wife anymore. His children saw him once a week, maybe. His skin looked pale under the lights, and he started referring to victims by number, not name. That was the only way he could sleep. The team began cataloging MO patterns, method of operation. Each new body told a familiar story, lured near a train station, often with a promise of help or food, then led into the forest. Sometimes raped, sometimes mutilated, always stabbed dozens of times. Overkill, they called it. One girl had 53 stab wounds, her eyes gouged, bite marks on her shoulders. She was 11. At the scene, a single coin was found, jammed into the soft earth. No fingerprints, no fibers, no name. Here's something odd. Many of the stab wounds were post-mortem, meaning he continued after death. Some psychologists suggest this points to a total lack of emotional connection, just pure compulsion. Others argue the opposite, that he was trying to continue the emotional connection even after life ended. A warped imitation of intimacy. Historians are still debating whether Chikatilo's crimes were sexually motivated or born from deeper humiliation. He reportedly struggled with impotence. As a child, he was bullied. During puberty, he was mocked for his awkwardness. There's speculation he may have suffered a brain injury at birth, but trauma doesn't excuse what he became. It only hints at how long he waited to become it. And here's the truly sick part. The execution of Alexander Kravchenko wasn't the last wrongful conviction in the case. Over the years, several men were arrested and jailed for Chikatilo's crimes. At least 3 were convicted. 1 hung himself in custody. You could almost call them collateral damage, if that didn't feel so disgustingly bureaucratic. Chikatilo wasn't just killing people, he was making the system kill itself. You see, every time the wrong person went down for his murders, the real killer watched. Not always in person, but he paid attention. He read papers, kept notes, adjusted his routine, and kept going. His tools changed. His routes evolved. He shifted from rail lines to bus stations, from train passes to hitchhiking. But the spiral never stopped. If anything, it tightened. In 1986, the killings suddenly paused. For the first time in nearly a decade, no new victims appeared. People relaxed. But predators like Chikatilo don't just stop, they wait. You'd be amazed how many people die with their eyes open. But in the case of Chikatilo's victims, that was rarely a choice. By the time the forensic reports came in, one detail kept showing up again and again: missing eyes. Some were removed with a blade. Others had been gouged out with fingers. It was deliberate, specific. He didn't just kill them. He made sure they couldn't see him. Not in life. Maybe not even in death. You might be wondering, why? Why the eyes? There's a Russian superstition, a deep one, that says the last thing a dying person sees is burned into their pupils. A kind of spiritual photograph. Some believe that a killer can be identified just by staring into those frozen eyes. Chikatilo grew up on those stories. So maybe, in his mind, gouging the eyes wasn't just sadism, it was self-preservation. But psychologists offer other ideas. They say it was about control, about domination, that the removal of the eyes symbolized total power, the final erasure of another human's identity. Historians are still debating whether his obsession with the eyes was myth-driven or a sign of deeper pathology. Either way, it was signature. Even Burakov started dreading the reports that mentioned it. Let me tell you about one of the victims, Larisa. She was only 13, found near a trail close to Lesnishestvo station. Her pockets were turned inside out, her shoes placed neatly beside her, her arms arranged across her chest like someone had tried to give her peace after stealing everything else. But it was her face that made Burakov pause. Her eyes were gone, clean, surgical. Burakov didn't cry often, not in those days, but he admitted in later interviews that Larisa haunted him, that he dreamed of her blinking, that he sometimes saw her reflection in train windows late at night. Because by now, the pattern wasn't just numbers. It was faces, real ones, dozens of them. And just when things couldn't seem more hopeless, the killings stopped. No more bodies in 1986 or in 1987. Not one. Some detectives thought Chikatilo had died. Others hoped he'd moved, fled, gotten sick. But Burakov wasn't convinced. You see, serial killers don't just vanish. They hibernate. So what made him stop? Turns out, after his 1984 arrest for acting suspiciously near a crime scene, remember? Chikatilo had been fired from his job, the one that gave him access to travel, factory sites, and train passes. Without that mobility, he couldn't hunt the same way. For 2 years, he was grounded. And guess what? During that lull, the case nearly closed. New leadership took over. Budgets shifted. Files were boxed up. Burakov was reassigned temporarily to other cases. The task force shrunk. And Chikatilo? He waited. He got a new job eventually, at a trade company. Not as prestigious, not as mobile, but enough. He started moving again, slowly, testing boundaries, like a wolf sniffing the wind. Then in 1988, the murders returned. First a boy, then a teenage girl, then 2 more, back to back. The wounds were the same. The rage was the same. But something had changed. The police were finally learning. Forensic teams were sharper. Reports were centralized. A small computer unit was created to track similarities in new crimes. And most importantly, Burakov was back. They started setting traps, watching transit stations more carefully, even circulating sketches, though unofficial, of course. No one was allowed to say serial killer, but they used words like maniac and dangerous vagrant. One officer even suggested installing cameras at larger stations. The proposal was denied. Too expensive, but the pressure was building. Chikatilo, unaware how close they were getting, began pushing harder. His victims grew younger, One was just 8 years old. Another was found with a torn comic book page clutched in her hand. Another chilling detail: several victims were found with bits of bark and leaves in their mouths, as if they'd tried to scream, but were silenced by the forest itself. Was he forcing that? Or were they biting down out of fear? We may never know. What we do know is this: he was unraveling. The cooling off periods between murders got shorter, the kills got sloppier. He began returning to previous locations, something he never did in the early years. He was slipping. The wolf, after years of success, was getting careless. And Burakov, he was closer than ever. His board was nearly full. The red pins were touching now, and they all pointed inward, toward one man. But they still didn't have a name, just a silhouette in the snow. Have you ever had that feeling, like someone's watching you? Not in a paranoid sense, more like a quiet, creeping awareness, as if you're being studied by someone with a plan. That's what Officer Igor Ryabov felt on October 20th, 1990. He was stationed at the Rostov-on-Don train station, assigned to monitor the platforms for suspicious behavior. Nothing glamorous, just long hours, cheap coffee, and the slow drift of winter fog rolling across the tracks. But that night, something caught his attention. A thin man in a shabby coat was loitering near the edge of the platform. He wasn't waiting for a train. No luggage, no ticket. He wasn't reading, wasn't eating, just pacing, watching, staring at young boys traveling alone. Ryabov trusted his instincts. He approached casually and asked the man a few routine questions. Got an ID: Andrei Chikatilo. Quiet voice, nervous hands. Claimed he was a consultant for a trade company, traveling for work. But he didn't match the train manifest. His story had gaps. Ryabov had read the bulletins. He knew the murder cases, the composite sketches, the behavioral red flags. He asked to check Chikatilo's bag. That's when things got strange. Inside, he found a rope, a jar of Vaseline, and a large sharpened knife, all neatly wrapped in newspaper. Now seriously, who packs that for a business trip? Ryabov radioed for backup. Chikatilo didn't resist, just stared at the ground blankly, as if bored. At the station they interrogated him, but Chikatilo didn't flinch. No criminal record, no physical evidence tied him to any scene. He brushed off the bizarre items as personal tools and medical supplies. After a full day of questioning, the prosecutors hesitated. No blood, no matching weapon, no victim DNA, so they let him go. Yes, they let the most prolific serial killer in Soviet history walk free. But Ryabov wasn't ready to drop it. He contacted Burakov. "I think I saw the guy," he said. "The real one." Burakov, burned out after years of failure, wasn't eager to hope. Still, he looked into it. Chikatilo's name came up again. It had appeared back in 1984, but he'd been dismissed due to a blood type mismatch. Let me explain that. Early in the investigation, Soviet labs had tested semen from several victims. The samples came back with AB blood type. In 1984, when they tested Chikatilo, his blood was typed as A, so they crossed him off the list. But here's the twist, and it's a strange one. Chikatilo had a rare condition known as a secretor status mismatch. In some individuals, the blood type in their bodily fluids doesn't match their actual blood type. It's rare. Only about 10 to 15% of people have it. Andrei was one of them. That strange, obscure biological anomaly let him escape justice for 6 more years. To this day, historians still argue whether it was Soviet science or Soviet bureaucracy that failed harder. Either way, it cost lives. But now, Burakov was listening. He ordered surveillance. They watched Chikatilo's home, tracked his movements, followed him from station to station, recording his habits. Same type of victim, same erratic pattern. He'd approach, talk, then pull back, testing, hunting. Then came the final break. On November 6, 1990, a young boy's body was discovered in the woods near the Lesnyshestvo train stop. Just hours before, Chikatilo had been seen in the area. That was enough. They brought him in again. This time they didn't let him walk. He remained silent for days, didn't eat, didn't sleep, just stared ahead. And then, slowly, he began to speak. And once he started, he wouldn't stop. He confessed to 34 murders in chilling detail. Names, dates, forest trails, abandoned factories, hidden ponds. Then he added more and more. Eventually, the number rose above 50. He drew maps, gave directions to undiscovered burial sites, led police to shallow graves, recalled what victims were wearing, cracked jokes about it all. Some officers said he talked like he was sharing a cooking recipe. Even Burakov, numb after years of horror, admitted that listening to those confessions made him physically sick. But even then, a confession wasn't enough. This was Soviet law. They needed airtight, corroborated evidence. So began the painstaking process of cross-referencing every single detail, matching his statements to open cases, reviewing photos, dates, shoe sizes, dental charts. Meanwhile, the public finally had a name. The media called him the Butcher of Rostov. The monster in the forest. The stories spread like wildfire. Rumors followed. Some claimed he was a demon. Others swore he was part of a cult or even a failed KGB experiment. People needed monsters, myths, but the truth was far more terrifying. Just a dull man in a gray coat blending in. Literally, a steel-barred cage placed in the center of the courtroom, like a wild animal on display. It was 1992, and the Soviet Union had just collapsed. Russia was unraveling, economically, politically, socially. But amidst all that chaos, one man still dominated the headlines. Andrei Chikatilo. His trial was held in Rostov-on-Don, and it wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle. I'm not exaggerating when I say that people lined up outside the courthouse for hours, just for a chance to catch a glimpse of the monster. Some brought binoculars. Others brought their children. It was like watching a macabre circus. And the cage? That wasn't for drama. It was for protection. Because the victims' families were ready to tear him apart. The atmosphere was electric. People screamed at him from the gallery. One mother threw a shoe at his head and cursed his bloodline. Another had to be dragged from the room after trying to break through security. I remember the footage, his pale, twitchy face behind those bars. He barely reacted. Sometimes he smirked. Other times he picked at his fingernails, completely disconnected from reality. But let me back up. There were 53 charges of murder against him. He confessed to all of them. He gave names, described how, explained why. And yet, the defense entered a plea of insanity. Yeah, that's the twist. Chikatilo's lawyers argued that he was not criminally responsible, that he was mentally unfit to stand trial, that he wasn't evil, just broken. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. They weren't entirely wrong. Psychiatrists did find signs of severe sexual dysfunction, schizoid personality traits, and early signs of paranoid schizophrenia. One expert said his inability to connect with others bordered on total detachment from empathy. But he also hid the bodies, changed locations, and adjusted his methods when the police got close. That's not random madness. That's control. That's planning. That's cold strategy. Historians are still debating whether Chikatilo was legally insane or just morally bankrupt in a way most of us can't comprehend. The court eventually sided with the prosecution. They declared him sane and fully responsible. The trial dragged on for months. Victims' families testified. Forensic experts presented gruesome evidence. Even Burakov took the stand, detailing the 10-year chase. And through it all, Chikatilo sat in that cage, tapping his fingers and yawning. Now I should tell you something strange. During one of the trial days, he suddenly stripped naked in the courtroom. No warning, no shame. He stood in his cage and shouted nonsense, waved his arms, and began ranting about mind control and secret police plots. Claimed he was being experimented on, that he was a scapegoat for the collapse of the USSR. He was removed, evaluated again, still found fit to stand trial. Honestly, it's hard to tell where the act ended and the truth began. Here's another bizarre twist. He actually corrected the prosecution on one of the charges. They accused him of killing a girl on a specific date. He interrupted them to say, "No, that's wrong. I didn't kill her until 3 days later. Check the records." And he was right. And he was right. The trial became less about proving guilt and more about deciding what to do with him. Some people wanted the death penalty. Others wanted him studied forever, locked away like a biological curiosity. I mean, how do you process a man who murdered over 50 children, some in broad daylight, and still managed to hold a marriage and a full-time job? It wasn't like he lived in the shadows. His wife, Fyodora, testified that she had no idea what he was doing. His kids played in the same rooms where he washed off blood. He kissed them goodnight after burying bodies in the woods. And the most haunting part? He was forgettable. Not charming, not scary, just gray, just average. The exact kind of man who could pass unnoticed in a crowd. And that made him so much more terrifying. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Let me give you one more detail. During his final statements, Chikatilo said, "I am a mistake of nature, a mad beast." No apology, no remorse, just the resigned acceptance that he had always been this way. The judge didn't hesitate. Guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by firing squad. Andrei Chikatilo was moved to a prison in Novocherkassk, where he spent his final months in solitary confinement. No visitors, no sunlight, no noise. Just a cot, a sink, and his memories. And a clock ticking louder with each day. They told him in the morning, February 14th, 1994, Valentine's Day. A guard walked into his cell at 5 a.m. and read the formal order. The execution would be carried out today. Chikatilo blinked, said nothing, just stared at the floor. I wonder if that was the first moment he ever felt something real. After years of chaos, killings, hiding, being hunted, his life now came down to one last sunrise, a final tray of prison food, and a wall in Novocherkassk. Let me take you there. The prison was old, Soviet gray. You can almost smell the damp concrete and rust. It's the kind of place where time doesn't just pass, it crushes you, slowly. Chikatilo had been kept in isolation since sentencing. No newspapers, no radio, just rumors, dreams, and the distant echo of boots. They gave him a simple breakfast, porridge, black bread, and weak tea. Not exactly a last meal with steak and pie. Russia didn't offer that kind of dignity. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about erasure. He wasn't a man anymore, just an object waiting to be discarded. He didn't eat much, just a few bites. Then sat in silence. At 7:30 a.m., the guards returned. One of them reportedly asked, "Do you want anything before we go?" Chikatilo looked up and said, "I'm already gone." Now here's something strange. There are no official photographs of his body. No confirmation of the moment. Just a short official statement. Sentence carried out. Some speculate this was to avoid martyrdom. Others believe the state wanted to erase him entirely. Historians are still debating whether Russia deliberately suppressed the execution details to keep Chikatilo from becoming a dark legend, a symbol of Soviet failure. But here's what we do know. He was led to a soundproof chamber. A doctor confirmed his identity. He was made to kneel, and without ceremony, a single bullet to the back of the head ended the life of the man who murdered 52 innocent children and teenagers. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he just slumped. And then, silence. The executioner's name is still unknown. The bullet casing was collected. Chikatilo's body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in an unmarked location. No grave, no shrine, no place to visit. It was the state's final way of saying, you no longer belong to the world. You'd think that would be the end, but it wasn't. After his death, the psychological autopsies began. Criminologists and behavioral experts dissected his past, his patterns, his pathology. Why did he do it? What made him start? Was it the war? Was it biology? One neurologist suggested a frontal lobe abnormality, citing his erratic speech and lack of impulse control. Another theory pointed to sexual sadism disorder, amplified by lifelong social deprivation. Some even proposed a rare epileptic condition to explain his dissociative states during attacks. But here's the creepiest theory I've heard: that he learned how to dissociate so completely, his crimes existed in a separate version of himself, a murder self that clocked in, did its work, and clocked out, like a night shift. He wore his crimes like a uniform, took it off at home, and his family never saw the blood beneath. One former KGB officer said he was not born a monster, he became one quietly. Want another disturbing fact? To this day, there are Russians who defend Chikatilo, claiming he was framed, that his confessions were coerced, that the real killer was someone higher up in the police or military, and Chikatilo was just a scapegoat, the face of a system that needed closure. There's no evidence for this, but conspiracy lingers like a bad smell. The most tragic part? There are still victims who haven't been identified. Even now, in rural Russian morgues, bones remain unlabeled. DNA degraded. Parents died without answers. Their stories are lost to fog and time. You might not survive this kind of history, the weight of it, the sadness, the anger. But you should remember it, not for him, for the children. So before we keep going, like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of storytelling really means something to you. And I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, city, country, local time. Let's see who else is out there, listening in the dark with you. Now let me leave you with a quiet scene. A morgue drawer, unlabeled. Inside, bones the size of pencils, a torn scarf, a plastic button from a child's coat, no name, no age. Just the remains of someone who never got to grow up. That's who this story is really about. If death is silence, Chikatilo's was thunder. In theory, the bullet should have ended it, closed the chapter, buried the past. But something strange happened after his execution. His story didn't fade. In fact, it began to echo louder. It echoed in classrooms, in courtrooms, in homes where the walls still smelled like sorrow. I once read that trauma doesn't disappear. It just gets passed down, a kind of psychological inheritance. And in Russia, the trauma of Chikatilo didn't just belong to the victims' families. It infected an entire generation. People locked their doors tighter. They watched their children with paranoid eyes. And a phrase entered everyday language. Don't walk alone. Chikatilo's dead, but the devil has twins. You feel that chill in your arms? Yeah, me too. Here's the part most people don't talk about. The copycats. Within 5 years of Chikatilo's execution, a disturbing trend began to appear. A rise in violent, sexually motivated murders across Eastern Europe, many mimicking his methods. Blunt force trauma, mutilation, victims left in rural woods. It was as if he'd left behind a blueprint for madness. One man in Belarus reportedly quoted Chikatilo during interrogation. I read about him. He found freedom through pain. I thought I could too. So, was it the media? Was it obsession? Or was it something darker? Something inside people waiting for permission? Historians are still debating whether the coverage of Chikatilo's crimes inadvertently glamorized his darkness, especially in post-Soviet media, where crime reports sold better than any fiction. Let me give you one particularly haunting detail. During the early 2000s, Russian police uncovered a fan club dedicated to Chikatilo on an underground web forum. It included scanned letters he had written from prison, pencil drawings of his ideal victim, and even instructions on how to feel nothing during a kill. One user went by the name Son of Red, a nod to Chikatilo's alias, the Red Ripper. He posted regularly. He had followers, and then he vanished. Weeks later, a woman was found dead in a Moscow park. Strangled, eyes damaged, clothing removed. No evidence, no witnesses, but police noted the pattern. They never found Son of Red. It makes you wonder, is evil contagious? Can a person become infected simply by reading, watching, following? And if so, where does responsibility lie? The killer? The culture? The silence? Let's shift focus for a moment. I want you to imagine a university lecture hall. The professor walks in, gray suit, horn-rimmed glasses. Behind him, a projector screen. The lecture? The Mind of Chikatilo, Criminal Psychology in Soviet Collapse. It's a real course, taught across multiple institutions in Russia and even Germany. Students study his childhood, read his interviews, analyze forensic reports. They debate nature versus nurture, biology versus belief. And somewhere in that same building, someone's laughing in the hallway, tapping on their phone, unaware that just down the corridor, a mind is unraveling under the weight of unspeakable acts. It's easy to turn these things into academic puzzles. It's harder to look at the people left behind. The mother who still keeps her child's photo on the windowsill. The father who blames himself for letting her walk home alone that day. The little brother who grew up in silence because no one wanted to speak the name. There's a story about one victim's grandmother. She refused to move, refused to change the sofa, even after the child's body was found. She said, "If I forget the weight of her body on this couch, then she dies again." I don't think we ever really recover from monsters like Chikatilo. We just learn how to carry the noise. Here's something else. Did you know that in 2015, a serial killer database created by Russian law students listed Chikatilo as Case Zero? Like Patient Zero. The origin. They considered him the template by which all modern Russian serial killers are judged. That database is still updated. Still growing. There are others now, younger, quieter, with better technology and fewer witnesses. They learned from him. But they also learned something else, how to vanish. Unlike Chikatilo, whose crimes were clumsy and compulsive, modern serial murderers are calculated. They erase themselves as they go. The age of digital fingerprints replaced the bloody shoe print. And that makes you wonder, how many Chikatilos are walking past us today? Quiet men, smiling, shopping, reading the news. They say evil wears many faces, but I've learned it mostly wears one. Normal. So before we keep going, like the video and subscribe, but only if you really find these stories meaningful. And let me know your city and local time in the comments. Maybe we're not so alone in the dark after all. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's keep going. Because while Chikatilo is dead, his echo isn't. You ever look at a map and see a blank space? Somewhere with no roads, no towns, just a blot of forest and silence? That's where we're going next. Because even though Chikatilo was executed, his hunting grounds didn't forget. There's a place called Shakti, tucked in the Rostov region, where people still don't let their kids out after sunset. I went there once, not for a story, not at first, just passing through on a train. But the moment I stepped off the platform, I felt it. The hush, like the ground knew what had happened there. And that hush has a name. Locals call it the Hollow. It's not an official name. You won't find it on any map. But it's where 3 of Chikatilo's victims were discovered in 1984, all within a few hundred meters of each other. Same burial style, same shallow graves, same forest that always seemed too still. I asked someone why they call it that. He said, because the birds don't sing there. He was right. I walked through it. Not a chirp, not a wing, just wind and those trees, thin, bare, watching. Some say it's superstition. Others say it's psychology. But here's the thing that sticks. When investigators returned to those woods in the early 2000s to confirm burial sites for academic documentation, they found a new body. It wasn't Chikatilo's work. He'd been dead for over a decade. But the MO was eerily similar. Female, teenager, damaged eyes, clothes removed, covered with pine needles. Only one thing was different. She had a modern wristwatch, digital. It was still ticking. They never solved that case, never named her. She became a footnote in a larger story, one page buried in a file of horrors. Some think it was a copycat. Others believe she was killed by someone who knew the woods long before Chikatilo ever walked them. Historians are still debating whether the hollow was always cursed, or whether Chikatilo made it that way. Here's something strange. A month after that discovery, the same pathologist who performed the original autopsies collapsed during an interview. He had been talking about patterns in the way the bones were found. He said it was like he was building a shape. That was his last sentence before fainting. They found nothing physically wrong with him, but he never spoke of the case again. Let's zoom out for a moment. There's a theory in criminology called geographic imprinting. The idea that serial killers leave behind a kind of psychic residue on the places they haunt. Not in a mystical sense, but in a very real, very practical one. Investigators map these zones to predict behavior. Chikatilo's zone is wide. It covers 5 cities, over 200 train stops, and more than 1,000 miles of rail line. And yet, again and again, the hollow remains the epicenter. Why there? No one's certain. But some survivors have noted that Chikatilo returned to that forest often, even when he didn't kill there. Just stood between the trees, breathing, waiting. One child who escaped him, barely, miraculously, said something chilling years later. He looked at the trees like they were listening to him. And here's your strange fact for tonight. In 1996, a geologist surveying the area found a Soviet military bunker hidden deep underground, less than a kilometer from where the first victim's remains had been found. It was decommissioned, rusted, empty, except for one thing. A single wooden chair bolted to the center of the floor, facing a wall. No windows, no papers, just a chair. To this day, no one knows who used it or why. Some speculate it had nothing to do with Chikatilo, that it was Cold War paranoia, just a leftover relic of tension and fear. Others, they think it was a place of preparation, a place to become something else. What do you think? Was it coincidence or ritual? Let me offer a thought. Sometimes we like to pretend that monsters are born in shadows, but I think they're born in the slow erosion of empathy. In places no one looks, places like the hollow. And if that's true, then we're not just talking about one man anymore. We're talking about a pattern, a place, a silence that teaches. So yeah, Chikatilo might be gone, but the hollow still stands, waiting, and we're not done. So before you get too comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you really want more stories like this. And don't forget to share where you're listening from and what time it is. I want to know where the hollow echoes next. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's keep going. Because the map still has blank spots, and not all of them stay empty. You ever notice how some monsters don't live in the woods or under the bed, but in the conference rooms, in clean suits, behind clean desks? Yeah. Let's talk about the people who let Chikatilo roam free. The ones who signed off, looked away, or worse, helped. Because here's the quiet truth. Monsters like him don't exist in a vacuum. They need infrastructure. And what scares me more than a man with a knife is the bureaucracy that protected him. In 1984, Chikatilo was arrested. Blood under his fingernails. Strange behavior. He didn't even deny everything. And still, he walked. You know why? Because of his Communist Party membership. Because someone up top said, that man is educated. He's not capable of this. Meanwhile, the real killer was hiding in plain sight, taking public trains to remote stops, picking off children like it was his job. And the police? They arrested over 1,000 people, coerced false confessions. One man even committed suicide after days of interrogation. But Chikatilo? He was too intelligent to be guilty. Want a strange fact? At the height of the murders, the KGB classified the entire investigation, not to stop Chikatilo, but to protect the image of the Soviet Union. See, officially, serial killing didn't exist under communism, Moral citizens didn't do that. So to admit there was a serial killer, that was politically impossible. They literally wrote it off as capitalist hysteria. Can you imagine that? A man murders over 50 people, and the government says, this can't happen here. It wasn't until Detective Isa Kostoyev defied orders that real progress happened. He tracked Chikatilo for months, saw the patterns, and even staked out train stations undercover. He broke rules. He was told to stop. He didn't. Kostoyev once said in an interview, "To catch a ghost, you must stop pretending your house isn't haunted." Here's what keeps me up. How many more ghosts were never caught, just because someone didn't want to admit they existed? Historians are still debating whether Chikatilo's reign would have ended earlier, if not for the Soviet system's obsession with control and secrecy. It's hard to prove a negative, but every delay cost a life. And when Chikatilo was finally caught, it wasn't some dramatic showdown. It was paperwork. An undercover officer noticed he was acting suspiciously, talking to children in a park. He was picked up, questioned, and then this time, finally, forensic evidence matched. It's infuriating to know they had already arrested him 2 years earlier and let him go. You want irony? The man who approved his release in 1984 quietly resigned when the truth came out in 1990. No charges, no explanation, just faded away. They buried that mistake deeper than the victims. Now, remember that old Soviet bunker in the hollow I told you about? Here's the kicker. After it was found, there were whispers, never confirmed, that files were recovered. Not about Chikatilo, about experiments, behavioral studies, prison logs, people whose names had been scrubbed clean. One name came up more than once, Dr. Igor Malkin. He wasn't a psychologist. He was a military interrogator, someone whose job was to shape minds. Rumor has it he worked on behavior modification during the Cold War. They said he believed you could teach cruelty the way you teach math. And get this, in 1979, the same year Chikatilo committed his first known murder, Malkin disappeared. His last known location? A psychiatric hospital in Novocherkassk, 20 minutes from where Chikatilo lived. No body was ever found. Some claim he defected. Others whisper that he became a patient himself. Still others, well, they think he found a protege. No proof, just overlapping timelines and a haunting sense of proximity. So here's the open question. Did Chikatilo become what he was on his own? Or was someone guiding the shape? A puppet master? Or just the reflection in the mirror? So before you close your eyes, maybe think about this. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't break rules. They write them. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And let me know where you are and what time it is. I want to know who's listening in the dark. Because we're closer to the end now. But endings aren't always the part that makes sense. It was November 20th, 1990, when they finally brought him in for what would become the most chilling interrogation in Russian history. They sat him in a cold room under harsh lights, offered him cigarettes and tea, and waited. Andrei Chikatilo didn't speak for hours. He just stared. You'd think a man like that would be twitching, sweating, snarling. But no, he was calm. Patient, almost polite, like a professor waiting for the right moment to start his lecture. You know what finally broke him? Not a threat, not evidence. It was a psychiatrist. Dr. Alexander Bukanovsky, a softly spoken, brilliant mind who had spent his life studying abnormal psychology, was called in as a last resort. The police had nothing else. So they brought in a man who could understand monsters. Bukanovsky sat across from Chikatilo and began reading a psychological profile out loud. Not accusatory, not judgmental, just descriptive. He spoke in a low, soothing voice, describing a man who had been humiliated as a child, a man who felt powerless, who lashed out in fantasies, who sought control over bodies because he had none over his own life. Chikatilo blinked. Then he began to cry, and finally he spoke. It took him just 4 days to confess to 56 murders. He didn't just list them, he relived them. With disturbing clarity, he described every detail, the location, the time of year, the victim's last words. He even drew maps and walked police to unmarked graves. You want a strange fact? He remembered what each victim was wearing. In some cases, the exact color of their shoelaces. That's the kind of memory that doesn't fade. Here's the part that made my skin crawl. Chikatilo didn't seem proud. He didn't gloat, but he also never apologized. It was like he was just finally being seen. Some officers reported that after he confessed, he became more energetic. He smiled more, like a weight had been lifted. Maybe it had. Because monsters are still human underneath. And sometimes being recognized for what you really are is the only form of relief they'll ever get. Now, let's talk about Dr. Bukanovsky for a second. He was the one who coined the term compulsive sadistic homicide in Russia. Before him, there wasn't even language in the Soviet criminal code for what Chikatilo had done. And Bukanovsky had an unusual approach. He didn't see evil in black and white. He believed that serial killers weren't born or made. They were complicated products of nature, nurture, and experience. And here's the academic debate. Was Bukanovsky right to get involved? Some experts say he enabled Chikatilo's desire for attention. That the killer confessed because he wanted someone to understand him, not because he felt remorse. Others argue that Bukanovsky saved lives, because without him, Chikatilo might never have cracked. Personally, I think Bukanovsky did what no one else could. He treated the monster like a mirror, not a beast, not a demon, just a man, broken, dangerous, and real. You know what Chikatilo told him during one of the interviews? I am a mistake of nature, of society, of all of it. He called himself a mad screw in the machine. But you have to wonder, what kind of machine builds that screw in the first place? And before you let yourself feel sorry for him, remember this. He led officers to a shallow grave where a 10-year-old girl had been buried in nothing but her school socks. He showed them, without emotion, how he had covered her with branches and walked away. No guilt. Just logistics. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And don't forget to drop your location and time in the comments. I love seeing where this story is traveling. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's keep going. We're almost there, but almost can be the longest part of the night. There's a special kind of hush that falls over a courtroom when evil walks in wearing handcuffs. On April 14, 1992, the trial of Andrei Chikatilo began in Rostov. You might expect chaos, flashing cameras, shouting crowds. But what happened was far stranger. Everyone fell silent, even the reporters, even the guards. And when Chikatilo was brought in, thin, hunched, balding, he didn't look like a monster. He looked ordinary, pathetic even. That's how evil sneaks up on you. Not in masks, not from the shadows, but in the form of someone who could be your neighbor, your uncle, the guy who bags your groceries. They had to cage him, literally. He sat in a barred enclosure, a makeshift cell inside the courtroom, like an animal at the zoo. Why? Because the families of the victims were so enraged, the judge feared they might try to kill him during the trial. One father did try. He got close enough to hurl a hammer before guards dragged him away. He shouted, "Let me kill him the way he killed my daughter." No one blamed him. Want a strange fact? This trial was one of the first in Russian history to be televised. Millions tuned in. Ratings skyrocketed. It became a national obsession, like a soap opera bathed in blood. But there was no thrill in it, only morbid curiosity, a desperate need to understand. By then, Chikatilo had confessed to 56 murders, though prosecutors only charged him with 53 due to lack of evidence on the rest. The defense? It was something else. They argued he was mentally unfit for trial, that he was delusional, psychotic, possibly schizophrenic. His lawyer insisted Chikatilo didn't grasp the gravity of what he'd done. But he did. Oh, he understood all too well. He corrected investigators on timelines. He pointed out inaccuracies on their maps. At one point, when shown a crime scene photo, he said, "That's wrong. The girl was under the leaves, not on top." That's not insanity. That's memory. So the judge rejected the insanity plea. And then it got darker. During the trial, Chikatilo would shout nonsense. Once he dropped his pants in court, screaming that the KGB had castrated him. Was he unraveling? Maybe. But some believe it was theater, a calculated act to confuse the court or evoke sympathy. Even now, historians debate whether Chikatilo's outbursts were signs of true madness or pure manipulation. Was he breaking down or directing the spotlight one last time? Here's my take. He knew exactly what he was doing. Because when the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he didn't flinch. He just stared, like he'd expected it. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. Russia didn't use lethal injection. They used bullets, straight to the back of the head. And this is the detail that stayed with me. A mother, whose 13-year-old son had been one of Chikatilo's victims, stood up during sentencing and whispered, "Finally." Not screamed, not cried, just finally. There's something deeply haunted about that word. You think a courtroom brings closure? It doesn't. Not really. It just draws a curtain. But the stage, the audience, and the horror, they never leave. They just fall quiet. Now here's something else. One of the guards who watched over Chikatilo in his final days said he spent his time writing long, rambling letters about his childhood, the war, and how he believed he was a sacrifice for a broken system. He never once mentioned the names of his victims. Not once. That silence, it says more than all the words he ever spoke. So before you get too comfortable, do me a favor, like the video and subscribe if you're into this kind of storytelling. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some white noise. And let's finish this together. We've got one last part, and it's the part no one ever wants to say out loud. Certainly. Here's your exact passage, rewritten in fluent and accurate English without altering the meaning or structure. Part 15, The Last Bullet. February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day. While most of the world exchanged candy hearts and whispered promises, a man named Andrei Chikatilo was led down a narrow hallway in Novocherkassk prison, Russia. The air was so still, even the guards stopped joking. You can always tell when death is in the building. It moves quietly, but it's heavy. Everyone feels it. Chikatilo didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't pray. He was blindfolded, marched into a small concrete room, and forced to his knees. Then came the shot. One bullet, to the back of the head. Fast, clean. Just like that, the worst serial killer in Soviet history was gone. They didn't notify his family right away. They buried him in an unmarked grave at an undisclosed location. Not for his protection, but to protect the country from remembering him. And yet, we remember. We always remember the monsters. You want a strange fact? Russia quietly abolished the death penalty shortly after Chikatilo's execution. His was one of the last. It's almost as if the country said, "That's enough. We've shot the devil. No one else deserves this kind of ending." But that doesn't mean the horror ended. In the years following Chikatilo's death, copycat killers emerged across Eastern Europe. Some even called themselves his spiritual successors. One of them, Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer, claimed he wanted to beat Chikatilo's record. He was caught in 2006. His goal? 64 kills, one for each square on a chessboard. He made it to 48. You ever hear that saying? When you stare into the abyss. Yeah, this is what happens when the abyss writes back. Now, let me ask you something. After all this time, after all these words, all these lives, do you feel safe? Because the scary part isn't Chikatilo himself. He's dead. The scary part is that there were so many chances to stop him, so many signs, so many people who were almost saved, but the system didn't see it, or didn't want to, or was too proud to admit it was blind. Even today, criminologists argue over what made Chikatilo what he was. Was it nature, nurture, trauma, a broken brain, or just hunger? The kind of hunger no food can satisfy. Historians are still debating whether the Soviet state unintentionally bred a killer by silencing pain, hiding crimes, and burying the truth. If you never admit darkness exists, how can you stop it? Now here's something I haven't told you yet. Among Chikatilo's many notebooks, written in prison before his death, was one chilling line. Just 5 words. The voices are still hungry. That line haunts me, because we like to think monsters are rare. But hunger? That's everywhere. So tonight, as you close your eyes, I want you to remember one thing. Chikatilo isn't coming back. But silence? Silence always returns. So if you hear something strange, something quiet, like footsteps behind you when no one's home, or a whisper that disappears when you turn your head, don't panic. It's probably just the past. It's over now. You made it through, and while your body might be still, I know your mind is probably racing. That's normal. That's the way stories like this work. They settle into the corners of your thoughts, like shadows in a room that looked safe before the lights went out. But you're not in danger. Not now. This was just a story, a retelling of terrible truths that happened far away, long ago. You're safe. You're home. And the world is quiet again. Let the quiet wrap around you, like a blanket. Let it hum in your ears. Your fan, your breathing, maybe the softest echo of night outside your window. The monsters are gone. The cages are closed. The voices are asleep. And maybe, just maybe, the next dream you enter won't be dark at all. Maybe it'll be soft. Maybe someone will be there. Someone kind. Someone who's been waiting for you in the light. Because stories don't just take us into the darkness, they lead us out of it too. So thank you for listening, for staying until the end. Not everyone makes it this far. You did. That means something. Now take a deep breath, loosen your shoulders, let the tension drain from your jaw, and when your eyes close for good tonight, let them fall gently, like curtains, and let the silence hold you until morning. End of script. Good night.